Thank you very much for joining me in this video. You know, COVID really took a toll on so many areas of our economy, especially the service sector. Restaurants had to close down, retailers had to close down. A lot of them didn't survive. But it also impacted the average consumer on the street. His job maybe was lost, hours could have been reduced, cash flow reduced, certainly. The government stepped in to provide some CERB relief, but they found that they didn't have the money that they used to have. And so the government, aware of that, tried to take action to help, and especially tenants, because they realized that tenants weren't able to pay the rent. They didn't want them out on the street. So they introduced something called the Protecting Tenants and Strengthening Community Housing Act 2020. The COVID itself, by and large, is behind us, but the act is still in place. And I think if you're a landlord, you need to be aware of the impact of this new act because it changed a little bit the scope of the Residential Tenancies Act. Actually, this act is very far-reaching. It amends the Residential Tenancies Act, which we're concerned about. It also amends the Housing Services Act and amends the Building Code and takes the Ontario Mortgage and Housing Corporation Act and totally replaces it. And there's a number of things in the act that don't really impact us from day to day. For example, land lease and mobile homes. And generally mobile homes are on land lease. And it speaks about that. It puts in some restrictions in place there. It provides some motivation for landlords if they need to upgrade their infrastructure, their sewer lines and water lines and so on. It deals with employers who provide company housing for employees. And it streamlines the Community Housing Act and helps bring that up to standard. But there are some things that it deals with that you and I run into on a day-to-day basis as landlords, and I want to talk about them. And one of the things is, as I said, as a result of COVID, a lot of people are finding they just don't have as much money as they had before. And when you're struggling along with so much money, you have to decide who's going to get paid and who's not. You're going to pay everybody less, or somebody's going to fall off. And the person who's quickest to fall off is the landlord. Because if the tenant is struggling and he's got a phone bill that's due, he's got a car payment that's due, his hydro bill is due, and his rent's due, he knows if he doesn't pay his phone bill, he's got no phone. He knows if he doesn't pay his hydro bill, he's got no hydro. He knows if he doesn't make his car payment, he's going to have his car taken away. But he also knows that if he doesn't pay his rent, it's a slow, long, laborious process. He's still going to have a roof over his head. So he doesn't pay the landlord. Or maybe he pays slowly, or maybe he gets behind. And there's always provisions in the Act for the landlord to take action and apply for an eviction order if the tenant is getting behind or if he's chronically slow. What the new Act is saying is before the board will issue an eviction order, they want the landlord and the tenant to sit down and hammer out a plan or a process of repaying the shortfall. And in fact, the Residential Tenancy Board will be very active as an arbitrator in hammering out some kind of a repayment plan. The good thing for the landlord is once this plan's in place, if the tenant doesn't adhere to it, then they're much quicker at issuing an eviction order at that point. The other thing I want to talk to you about, we've talked about it before, and it's important that we underscore it, is no-fault evictions. And this is where a landlord will evict the tenant because he needs the property for himself or for his immediate family, or more likely he's selling the property and the new buyer wants the tenant evicted because he needs it for himself or his family. And if he does need it for himself and his family, then there's no real problem. The problem is it's been grossly misused. Why? Because property values have gone up a lot during the COVID era. And consequently, servicing that debt means that rents have gone up a lot. But that's market rent. In reality, if a tenant is there, their rent hasn't gone up. And so the actual rent has lagged far behind the market rent. And if a new owner has paid market value today for the property, he needs a lot more rent to service the debt. So what he needs to do is raise the rent. Well, he can't do it if the tenant's in there, but he can if a new tenant comes in. So under the guise of needing it for his family or for himself, he gives a notice to the tenant that that's what's required and gets the tenant to move. And the tenant is required to move. But what the Act does now is say, okay, if the tenant finds out that the landlord or the beneficial owner gave notice and didn't really follow through, he maybe painted it up, fixed it up, maybe he moved the son in for a few weeks or a few months, but then put it back on the market at market rent, the tenant can appeal to the board and the board will investigate. And it used to be the tenant could come up to 12 months to challenge. Well, now that 12 months has become 24 months. And also, the Act has legislated that when the landlord gives the tenant notice, the landlord must also pay him 1 month compensation for the inconvenience of being evicted. So that's what's changed in the no-fault evictions. But the other thing is some landlords will say, okay, I got to evict the tenant because I'm doing extensive renovation to the property. And sometimes they are. They may knock a wall down, make it open concept, change the carpet, paint. They do some things that makes it very difficult for the tenant to live there. So they evict the tenant. But then when they put it back on the market for rent, they put it at market rent. And of course, now it shows better. It's going to bring more rent anyway. Well, the new Act says, all right, after the extensive renovations, the existing tenant has to be offered the first opportunity to move back in at his old rent. And there's very substantial penalties if that doesn't happen. One of the things that the board can award is if the tenant has had to rent something else, the landlord's going to have to pay the rent differential between what the tenant was paying and what he is paying for a full 2 years up to a maximum of $35,000. And of course, there's significant penalties as well. Some of the things that the Act has made available to the board can apply to the courts and much more easily get a court order to have all the landlord's financial records made available to them. They can examine the financial records and they can find out if there's anything inappropriate going on. The fines they can charge, the individual fine used to be $25,000. It's increased to $50,000. And if you hold the property in a corporation, it used to be a maximum of $100,000, but now that's moved to $250,000 maximum. And so there's some very, very significant stiff penalties involved. I want to remind you, when you're kind of feeling overwhelmed by this, that this is consumer protection legislation. And in the eyes of the government, a landlord is not a consumer. The tenant is a consumer. So they're protecting the tenant at the expense of the landlord. And bear in mind that these things are in place. I think if you have a good relationship with a tenant and you're a good landlord, these things aren't even going to enter into it. Life's going to go on and everything's going to be fine. But you need to be aware of them. But I think it also underscores the importance of doing your homework when you're renting the unit out. Take your time. Don't be in a hurry. If it's sitting vacant and it means sitting vacant for another month, so be it. It's a lot better to have it vacant than wish it were. Once you get a bad tenant, you've got some real serious problems. Get a good tenant, a good landlord, and everything works forward wonderfully. I'm a big believer in being a residential landlord. I think you'll find that the Money Machine seminar and the principles absolutely work, but there are some speed bumps, there are some challenges. You need to be aware of them. Thank you very much for investing your time in this video. I'll talk to you again next week.